They say in certain valleys, you can hear the past breathing. In the hollers of eastern Kentucky, where the ridgelines fold over themselves like sleeping giants, the wind doesn't just carry the scent of pine and wood smoke, it carries whispers. Names that aren't in any census, deeds written in blood instead of ink, vows that never saw a church, but still bound tighter than iron. If you stay long enough, you'll realize the people here don't just tell history, they guard it, bury it, and sometimes they breed it into the next generation so it never escapes. Her name was Mercy in Holloway. The first time anyone from outside the valley saw her, she was barefoot, standing in a field of frost-bitten corn in a dress so thin it might as well have been made of smoke. She was 8 years old. A neighbor, one of the few who dared to speak later, remembered that she had the same unnervingly pale gray eyes as her father, the same sharp cheekbones, and the same habit of staring just past you, like she was listening to something only she could hear. What no one knew, at least not then, was that her life had already been decided. Mercy's wedding had been planned before she had lost all her baby teeth. The Holloway family was not large in number, but it was ancient in presence. Their land had been carved from the mountain in 1814 by Ezekiel Holloway, a man who, according to the one surviving family journal, took no pleasure in strangers. He built his cabin by hand, felled his own trees, and planted his own graveyard before the first roof beam was set. By 1820, Ezekiel had two wives, sisters from Tennessee, who bore him 17 children between them. But Ezekiel had no interest in sending those children out into the world to marry and scatter. "The Lord gave me all I need," he wrote, "and I'll keep it close, same as a shepherd keeps his flock." Generations passed, and the Holloway bloodline wound in on itself like a snake eating its tail. Cousin married cousin. Uncle married niece. Widows were given to brothers of their dead husbands. By the turn of the century, the Holloways had stopped attending church altogether. Preachers who came up the mountain left without holding service, sometimes without their horses, claiming that the air in the Holloway homestead was thick as breath in a coffin. Mercy's mother, Elsie Mae Holloway, had been born to a father who was also her uncle and a mother who was also her cousin. She was 23 when she gave birth to Mercy, her only surviving child after 5 others were either stillborn or too wrong to keep breathing, as the midwife put it. The midwife never returned after that night. Mercy grew up in a house that wasn't really a house anymore, but a patchwork of additions, rooms built onto rooms, until the original cabin was buried deep inside like a heart. Corridors were narrow and crooked, lined with mismatched doors, some nailed shut, some opening to nothing but a wall. Mirrors hung at strange heights, catching your reflection only in fragments. A visitor once said it felt like the house itself was trying to remember what it used to be. By the time Mercy turned 8, her father had already begun what the Holloways called the choosing. In most families, a girl's 8th birthday might mean dolls or ribbons. For Mercy, it meant being summoned to the wedding room, a narrow space upstairs where lace curtains had yellowed with age, and a cedar chest stood at the foot of an unused bed. Inside the chest were rings, wooden, bone, silver, all carved by Holloway men over decades. Her father lifted one, a thin band of polished oak, and slid it onto her finger. "This is a promise," he told her. "One day you'll stand here beside your own blood and make it true." The man she was promised to was not a boy her age. He was 27, her father's first cousin and best friend since boyhood. His name was Caleb Holloway, and he had been waiting for the right one since his last intended bride, Mercy's half-sister, had died in childbirth at the age of 14. Neighbors, what few there were, noticed changes after that day. Mercy stopped playing outside. She stopped speaking to anyone but her parents. At night, they said, you could hear singing from the Holloway house, low, droning hymns that didn't sound like anything from a church. Sometimes it was just one voice, sometimes two, blending so closely it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. In the summer of 1938, a traveling doctor came through the valley to treat an outbreak of scarlet fever. He stayed one night at a farmhouse on the edge of Holloway Land. Over supper, he asked about the family up the ridge. The farmer and his wife exchanged a look and said only, "Best keep to the low roads." But the doctor didn't listen. The next day, he made his way to the Holloway home, thinking he might find patients in need. He never said what he saw inside, only that when he left, he locked his satchel and never returned to the mountains again. He died 2 years later, his journal containing one single entry about that visit. The child has her mother's face and her father's eyes. They both know it. By autumn, word spread quietly that the Holloways were preparing for a celebration in the spring. In the valley, that could mean anything from a barn raising to a funeral. But one old man, too old to fear the family, told the truth to anyone who would listen. "They're marrying the little one," he said, "8 years old, and they'll wed her before she turns 9. Been done before. Will be done again." What happened that following spring is still debated among the few who claim to remember. Some say the ceremony was held at night by lantern light, the preacher a Holloway cousin brought in from another county. Others say there was no preacher at all, just a ring, a vow, and the blessing of Mercy's father. But all agree on one thing. After that spring, Mercy was never seen in the fields again. When she did appear, it was at Caleb's side, her belly already beginning to swell. By the time the dogwoods bloomed in the spring of 1939, the valley had gone quiet. It wasn't the kind of quiet that comes from peace. It was the silence of people keeping their heads down, pretending not to notice what they saw out of the corners of their eyes. Those who passed near Holloway Land swore they could hear crying from the house, not the sharp wail of a child, but the muffled, exhausted sob of someone too young to understand what had been taken from her. Mercy was 9 years old and already showing the signs of pregnancy. Her frame was so small the swelling looked unnatural, as if her body was rejecting the change, but had no power to stop it. She wore long homespun dresses that dragged in the dirt and sleeves that covered her hands. Some claimed this was to keep the biting flies off her, but others whispered was to hide bruises. Caleb Holloway treated her with a strange, possessive gentleness in public, hovering close, speaking for her, never letting her out of his sight. To outsiders, it might have looked like protection. To those who knew the family ways, it was ownership. In the Holloway creed, a wife was a man's property from the day she was promised, and property was not meant to speak to strangers. The midwife brought in for the birth was not from the valley. She was a young woman from 3 ridges over who had no idea what she was walking into. She arrived in June, carrying her leather satchel
Subscribe
and
to my
humming to
channel.
herself, until she stepped into the Holloway house and saw her patient. She later told her sister that the sight turned my stomach before I even knew why. Mercy sat on a narrow bed in a darkened room, her hair loose and tangled, her eyes fixed on the wall. She did not look at the midwife when she entered. She did not speak when spoken to. It was only when the midwife knelt to check her that she realized she was not dealing with a woman at all, but a child. The birth was a slow, grueling nightmare. Mercy's body was too small to deliver easily, and each contraction racked her like a storm hitting a sapling. The midwife pleaded with Caleb to fetch a doctor, but he refused. "No outsiders," he said. "This is Holloway business." By the end of the second day, the air in the room was thick with the scent of sweat and blood. When the child finally came, it did not cry right away. The midwife, shaking, wrapped it in a faded quilt and tried to hand it to Mercy, but Caleb took it instead. Some say the baby lived only hours. Others insist it lingered for a few days before being returned to the Lord by means no one dared to describe. What is certain is that no grave was ever marked. and the midwife was sent away before the week was out. She never returned, though years later, she was overheard telling a minister that she had seen the face of something God didn't intend. Mercy's body healed slowly, but something in her mind seemed to shut down completely. For months, she wandered the house at night, barefoot and silent, moving from room to room as if looking for something she'd lost. The older Holloways didn't stop her. They believed in letting grief walk itself out. But Caleb grew restless. A man his age was expected to father many children, and Mercy's youth was both an obstacle and, in the Holloway way of thinking, a temporary condition. By winter, whispers began again. Caleb's gaze had shifted toward another girl in the family, a cousin of Mercy's who had just turned 10. In the Holloway system, such a change was not betrayal, but rotation. It was a practice designed to strengthen the bloodline by ensuring that every fertile female bore children to more than one male relative. The journals found decades later would show lists, names, ages, and pairings planned years in advance. Mercy's name appeared next to Caleb's for her first two pregnancies, then beside her own father's. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the meaning was clear. Mercy's second pregnancy came when she was 11. By then, the shape of her face had hardened into something almost ageless, neither child nor woman. Her eyes were dull most days, but on rare occasions, a flash of fear or fury would spark through, quickly smothered. The second birth was easier than the first, but the child was not healthy. Born with a twisted spine and unable to feed properly, it lived only a week. Caleb buried it somewhere on the ridge, and Mercy was not allowed to go. The outside world remained oblivious. The Holloways were masters of isolation. They traded only with those they trusted, and they handled their own disputes without lawmen. It wasn't until the 1950s, long after Mercy had vanished from public sight, that anyone from the state came asking questions. By then, most of the elders were dead, the journals hidden, and the few who knew the truth too afraid or too bound by blood to speak. What happened to Mercy in the years after her second child remains a matter of speculation. Some claim she died young, buried in an unmarked grave alongside her children. Others believe she was given to another branch of the family in West Virginia, where she lived out her days in the same shadowed silence she'd known since childhood. A handful of locals even insist they saw her as an old woman, wandering the tree line in a faded blue dress, her gray eyes still fixed on something no one else could see. The Holloway house eventually rotted into the earth, the patchwork of rooms collapsing under the weight of decades. Nature took back the fields. The graveyard, once neatly fenced, is now just a tangle of briars and stone markers, worn smooth by time. But those who grew up in the valley still talk of the girl who was promised at 8, wed before 9, and broken before she ever had the chance to grow. They say her story is a curse, a warning, and a reminder of how far some will go to keep a bloodline pure. And when the wind comes down off the ridge on certain nights, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke, some swear you can hear the faint sound of a child's voice, humming a tune that no one remembers learning because it was never meant to be sung outside Holloway blood.